Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my January wrap up. So it is the 7th of January, so I thought I'd give you guys an update about what I've finished so far this month. So I started off the month by finishing Fugitive Telemetry by Martha Wells. This is, I believe, book 4, maybe 5 in the Murderbot Diaries. It is one that I read out of order, I think, right? Yeah, so this is probably 5, and then I have to read 4 now because Jess told me that it's better to read this one before I read the one that came before because of the chronology of the story. This one was not as great for me just because most of its plot resolves around solving a murder, and if you know me, murder plot lines really don't work for me. It's a sort of goal as well for 2024 to really like better research my books, and if it's clearly has a murder mystery plotline at its center, not try to convince myself that maybe this one is the exception, because it almost never is the case that they are the exception. And there are so many books that I want to read that I might as well eliminate every one of them that has like a clear murder mystery plotline. Like if it is by one of my favorite authors, or like in the case of Martha Wells, in the middle of a series that I am invested in, then sure, I'll read it. But if it's like a new series or a standalone or whatever, then I might as well just say like, no, pass this one. I don't need to try. So Fugitive Telemetry, I did still enjoy, like the murder bot's personality and elements to the plots like that are like typical of the Murderbot series. I enjoy the interaction with like the crew that we meet in book number 1. But yeah, the plots really was an impediment to my enjoyment of this particular book. I did read the majority of this in 2023, but I did finish it in 2024. And then I went into a challenge that I have a vlog for that you can already see normally. Normally I will have edited before the end of the month, and that in that one I am reading 3 arcs. I did a sort of like challenge in which I tried to read as much as possible within 24 hours, not within 1 day period, but like 24 actual reading hours. I took like an hour and a half more or something to get through these 3. The first one is the 24-hour Cafe by Libby Page. All of these 3 arcs are arcs that I'm long overdue for there, so they're long been published already. The 24-hour Cafe is a contemporary story in which we're following mainly these 2 girls who work at a cafe that is open 24/7. And so they each alternate their shifts. They each have a 12-hour shift to take care of that day. And so we follow them as they are in the cafe. And then we also get stories intermingled from people who are visiting the cafe. And it's very much a story about, friendship and the dynamics that can kind of develop within friendships. And they are very close knit, but they are also they have a very close knit bond, but they also have had some instances that have recently happened that have kind of pushed their relationship a little bit more in a sort of like unsure direction. And one of them is actually about to have a life altering change happening that might also change the dynamics of their relationship. I really enjoyed this one a whole lot. This one is set over 24 hours as well, so you can read a chapter per hour, and then in 1 day you are done with this book. And I really enjoyed consuming it like that. And then we have the Apocalypse 7 by Jean Doucette, which is a post-apocalyptic story. This one was just okay for me. I thought that the plot was fine, but there was no deep exploration of particular themes or anything like that. There was no deep character work, so it was just like a plot-based escapist type of read, which occasionally might work, but I typically look for something more within my stories, and it doesn't have to be like super deep, but it just needs to have like some food for thought, and this one for me didn't have that at all. So it wasn't like a chore to get to or anything like that, but it also wasn't really tickling my fancies. And then the final one that I've read so far is Synopticon, which is a anthology of sci-fi written originally in Chinese and translated at this point in time. Some of these authors have not been published in English, or not yet at the time at least in which Synopticon came out. And so it is just a look at what Chinese sci-fi has to offer. I thought it was a really interesting collection. There were a lot of pieces that had really interesting concepts to explore. As with an anthology, some are always going to be better than others, or like they're going to work better for you than others. And so there are 3 stories in here, for example, that really worked really well for me, that I really enjoyed, and like that took me no time to get through. But then there were other stories that just didn't really work as well for me. But I did definitely enjoy going through this anthology, and I'm definitely going to be looking for the authors of the 3 stories that I've read, whether they have already been translated into English. All right, Future Cleo here. You will see this version of me quite a few times in like my March wrap-up and my April wrap-up, because I've just filmed 2 clips for that before going into the remainder of my January wrap-up, because my plan had definitely been to restart the filming of my wrap-ups in January the way that I'd always been doing them, you know, like vlog style throughout the month. The month of January was not very successful in that. I just have the previous clip that you just saw. In the month of February, I completely forgot about it again. But the month of March and April, there I have my full wrap-ups already filmed at this point in time. And for the most part edited, except for like putting the stats at the bottom of the screen and stuff like that. So they should, like, I should be, if I film this and then I film my February wrap-up, I should be very close to catching up to the wrap-ups. But so, let's dive into my statistics for the month of January and look at what else I still read within the month of January. And I gotta say, the month of January was actually quite successful. I guess it's the sort of like start of a new year and like new resolutions and stuff like that, because the month of January, or maybe the end of December, I kind of decided that I wanted 2024 to be the year of the DNF. No longer am I going to struggle through books. I'm going to put them down when I don't feel like they are working for me, or like they're disappointing me or something like that. So I went into it with that expectation, and simultaneously with the idea of being more like lenient when it comes to a 5-star read. A 5-star read doesn't have to be a book that changes my life. A 5-star read can also be a book that I just really enjoyed a whole lot, that brought back the joy of reading. So yeah. We see that reflected within this video, or maybe the DNF thing is more for February. I'm not entirely sure anymore. But so I already talked about those. But so I talked about the first 4 books, but I also finished a few others. So next up, a 5-star read. So I read A Mage of No Renown by Cal Kate. This is basically a sort of like prequel novel in the world of King's Dark Tidings, but it is a novel in which we're following a different character. It is a character we are introduced to also within the first book of King Dark Tidings, and that is Wesson. Wesson is a mage we are introduced to, but we've never really gotten his full backstory when it comes to the books that have taken place, that have been part of King's Dark Tidings, and this book is going to rectify that. Going into it, I wasn't entirely sure whether I was going to like it as much as I like the King's Dark Tidings books, because a big element to the King Dark Tidings books is Reskin. I love the character of Reskin. I love the sort of like situations that are created because of his like sort of social ignorance. And so I wasn't entirely sure whether Wesson could carry his own book, but he absolutely can. I really enjoyed this one. As I said, it's a 5-star read. Wesson at the beginning of this book basically grows into his magical powers with disastrous consequences. And then he basically sets out to learn how to control his magic. However, he has a huge potential when it comes to destructive magic, but he does not want to use destructive magic. He does not agree with that being his strength. He does not want to go into, for example, like warfare or anything like that. So he is trying to look for an alternative path, whereas nobody believes that he is able to, and whereas everybody is telling him that he should just embrace the power that he is naturally inclined to. Really enjoyed this one, as I said. 5-star read. All of Cal K's book for me are just like, you know, popcorn reads. I go through them super fastly. I enjoy every minute of it. It's just a fun ride, and this one was no exception. Next up, I finished Authority by Jeff Vandermeer, second book in the Southern Reach trilogy, and I gotta say I was somewhat disappointed in this one, I guess, because I don't know, because of this book, it's basically the behind the scenes to some extent of the previous book. Like, not really, it takes place after the events of the first book, but the first book you're like in the action with the guys in the field, because in that one you are like following a group of researchers who go into this mysterious area X, to figure out what is going on there, and then the initiative that's basically sent them in there, that is what you are following in the second book, and I was just expecting some answers, I guess, just because of that fact, but it turns out that they really also don't know what is going on, that they're basically also really just trying to find answers, and this book is not giving you answers, and this book, just like the first one, is all vibes, all weirdness, and I'm just still not entirely sure whether it really works for me, and maybe I should just go into them more like in a physical read rather than the audiobook format as I did, because I feel like I was just like zoning out a little bit too much when it comes to this book. Next up we have The Family Chow by Lan Samantha Chang. Sorry to editing self, I know I have this book physically, but I'm too lazy to go and grab it. So this is a family drama, let's say. This is a book in which we're looking at a family of Chinese immigrants into America. They run a family business, they run a diner, and it's kind of looking at the intergeneration conflict when it comes to this type of situation. You know, you have the parents who came over from China into America to find a better life for themselves and for their children, and they've established this really successful business that is beloved within the community, for example, and so there is this expectation on their end for their children to kind of continue on in that family business, which then clashes with the children's expectation of living their own life and fulfilling their own dreams, and then there's also a mysterious circumstance involved here with a body that is found within the freezer. So I did enjoy this, but I feel like overall it's just sort of like middle of the road for me. Like, it's a type of like this type of intergenerational conflict, this type of family situation I feel like I've explored in other books before, and like this one didn't necessarily stand out to me in that sense, and whereas, you know, it wasn't difficult to go through it, it also didn't really like, it doesn't linger with me. I can definitely still remember parts of it and part of the conflict between the characters, but it's not one that's going to stay with me, or that like in a year's time I'll think back on and be like, oh yeah, that was a really good read. I'll just be like, okay, yeah, I read that. And that'll be it. Then we have one that I find much more interesting, which is The Tusks of Extinction by Ray Naylor. This is another novella, and this is one that really worked very well. Like, it's not a 5-star read, but it's definitely one that I find really interesting, and that is what I mainly like. That's what I'm looking for in literature a lot of the time. So in this one, we're looking at cloning of mammoths. Mammoths are brought back to life through new technology that we have available to us. However, this kind of looks into that whole concept of nature versus nurture. You can bring back the nature that is a mammoth, but how are you going to tackle the nurture aspect? Because bringing back mammoths when there are no living mammoths around in the environment anymore means that there is no other mammoths to teach new mammoths how to be a mammoth. And basically this book is going to try and teach mammoths how to be mammoths. That concept is basically what immediately made me go like, I want to read this, and it's really interesting because it basically injects or like implant the brain of a woman who is basically an elephant ranger into the body of one of these mammoths, so that she can use her knowledge of how elephant groups work, how elephants socialize, survive, treat one another, use that knowledge to teach the mammoths how to be mammoths. And a lot of this story kind of explores the idea of conservationship and kind of explores different sides of that. So basically these mammoths are living in a reserve where they are basically protected. People cannot really, like, they can go to the reserve, but there are definitely safety measures in place. So it kind of looks at these different safety measures that are needed to ensure the peaceful life of these mammoths, and looking at different ways in which they're achieving that, but also looking at sort of like the gray area of bringing in money and how sometimes they have to choose they make sort of like morally questionable decisions in order to get money in, which for example they do by offering the possibility to kill one of these mammoths for a huge sum of money. So this sum of money then goes into the conservation of the rest of the group of mammoths, but you are then supporting the hunting business in order to continue conservationship. So I thought that this was like really interesting to look at. There are quite a lot of things having to do with the economics of the economics and the politics of running a reserve like that, being addressed within this book, as well as then also of course looking at the idea of nature versus nurture, how to as well as then that thematic of nature versus nurture, but also like the involvement of rangers within the group. You know, she's basically a scientist who has been brought into this role, but then she becomes of course part of this group of mammoths, and the sort of idea of like objectionably standing at the sidelines and just like steering an experiment becomes much less objective, as she's basically part of that reality, part of that group, making real connections with these animals. So yeah, thought that one is just a really interesting one, that just really like food for thought, which is one of the things that I love most about literature, is books that make me think. Next up we have the only book that I've read in Spanish so far this year, and that is Las Indignas by Agustina Bastarrica. This is not yet translated into English. The title would be, I guess, The Unworthy. This is the author of 10 Rivers of Flesh, which was like super popular on BookTube a few years ago when it came out, and is a 5-star read for me. And this is another 5-star read. I will say that, like, it's a 5-star read in as far as I can have a Spanish book be a 5-star read, in the sense that I did not understand every single thing about this book, because my level of Spanish is good, but not that great that I can read a Spanish book without having these moments of being like, wait, I don't think I fully understood that. I feel like for the most part I was getting through this book relatively okay, but because of its setting, there's quite a lot of religious undertones, and so there's a lot of a lot of vocabulary involved that was more difficult for me, and so I had to do more looking into the vocabulary for that. But in principle, I'm gonna label this a 5-star. I'm gonna allow myself to label this a 5-star, and we'll have to see when I finally read the English, or when I reread this in Spanish, whether that holds up. But I really thought it was another one of those interesting ones. It's one that has a lot to say, and one that sparks a lot of thought within the reader. So it is a post-apocalyptic book in which we're looking at a world where sickness is there's a lot of sickness because of climatic change. As a consequence, humanity is struggling, and as a consequence humans have become much more violent, and crime is much more prevalent, as we often see with post-apocalyptic novels. But there is this sort of like isolated setting, this group of women that basically find refuge in this sort of shelter, which is very much a sort of like cult setting. So it has very much like heavily religious tones there. It feels very much like a sort of like monastery setting, with a guy at the top, because of course if you're gonna have a religious society with women, it would be too nice to have it be just women. You have to have some mysterious guy at the top being like the cult leader, right? And so these women are kind of like classified into different layers of worthiness, basically. So you have the guy at the top, of course, and then sort of like the woman who runs the whole thing and kind of keeps things in order. And then you have basically the ones who are found worthy, and those are basically like not really seen anymore. The moment that they kind of ascend to worthiness, they kind of disappear behind some door somewhere, and nobody really knows what goes on with them at that point in time. Then you have certain characters, I think they are a different class, but it's been a while now, so I'm not entirely sure anymore, who are also higher in the ranking, but for some reason, who are a little bit higher in the ranking, but they also have basically been physically mutilated. One group of them have had their mouth closed, another group have their eyes sewn shut, another group has their eardrums punctured. Then you have the unworthy, which our protagonist is part of, who are basically trying to prove that they are worthy enough, that they are clean enough to be able to ascend to another one of these groups. And then you have the very lowest of the low, like the servants, who are basically women who, when they entered into this shelter, they were already affected by the illnesses that run amok outside of this shelter. And so we're following our protagonist, who is this girl who is part of the unworthy, who's trying to prove her worth, who is basically keeping a secret diary of the goings on within this monastery, while also taking us back to events that have taken place earlier within her time in this monastery, but also before entering into the monastery. And it's a really interesting book, of course, exploring a lot of themes having to do with religious institutions and the what do I call that? The restrictiveness of those institutions and the way that they basically keep people in like closeted, keep them bound by these strict rules and regulations, and like thus restrict their freedoms and their freedoms of expressions. It has queer relationships within it as well, and it's just really dark, grim, moody, weird at times, and that's just what I like. Okay, and then the final book that I'm going to talk about now is The Shadow of What Was Lost. This is a reread, but it is a book that is also bumped up from 3.5 stars to 5 when I reread it, and I'm just like really confused about my 3.5 star rating when I originally read it, clearly, because I mean, this can of course happen. There are books that you give really high ratings that over time you're like, yeah, this book hasn't really stuck with me, so it probably wasn't really, like, it couldn't be like a 5 star at the moment, but it's not a book that's stuck with me, so at this point in time it wouldn't be a 5 star anymore. And this book is kind of the opposite. Like when I first finished it and I gave my sort of like objective rating to it, I gave it a 3.5, but this is a book that has stuck with me much more than any other book has. Before this reread, I was more or less still aware of most of the plot lines of this book, which I can definitely tell you is not common for me. I have a really shitty memory, and so a lot of the times I forget a lot of things about the books that I read. Even at this point in time, you know, we're in May, and for some of these books that I've read in January, it's already more difficult for me to remember what I actually read, what actually happened in those books. But with The Shadow of What Was Lost, like 2 years down the line, I still more or less remembered most of the plot lines of that book. And it's just a book that, you know, upon reread, I appreciated even more how much I enjoyed this, and, you know, the push that I have through that novel. So it's a book in which we're looking at a group of 3 friends who are basically part of this magical school. In this world, the gifted, which is the name of the magical people, are very much looked down upon, because there has been this conflict in the past between aurors, who are a different type of gifted, and who were basically like uber powerful at that point in time, and both the aurors and the gifted were responsible for quite some harm to non-gifted people. And so when the aurors basically lost control of society and basically took a tumble down, there were a lot of restrictions placed on the powers of gifted people, and gifted people basically now can do almost nothing to harm non-gifted people, which results in a lot of abuse on the side of non-gifted, where they abuse the situation knowing that the gifted are magically bound and restricted from using their powers against them. And so in this magical academy, basically anybody who is gifted is sent to one of these academies to learn to control their powers, and if they are unable to do so, then their powers will be stripped of them. And so we meet up at the beginning of the book knowing that this test is coming up, and that one of these 3 friends basically has been struggling with his powers. He's only really been able to use his powers the first day that they manifested, and since then he's basically just been struggling to try and replicate what he did back then. And so he is fearing that he will be turned into a shadow. However, the evening before his big test, one of the elders meets up with him in his room and tells him that he's actually secretly one of these Aurs that I talked about earlier, and that he should basically make a run for it because, you know, the Aurs are believed to have died out at that point in time. They're definitely all looked upon with a positive mindset, and this elder tells him, you need to go out, you need to run at this point in time, you need to go north towards the boundary, because there is this boundary that's keeping out an ancient evil, and this boundary is apparently losing power, and he as an Aur has the power to strengthen it again. Now, not going to say more than that, but I really enjoyed this book. I really enjoyed this series. I think the first one is probably both objectively and in my mind the most solid one of the series, in the sense of both structurally and entertainment wise and understanding wise is the easiest one, I guess. That's not the easiest one, but the most perfect one. It has a solid structure, it has a storyline that you can quite easily follow, and you know, it's pretty well self-contained. It's not like the story is finished after you read it, but it definitely has a nice progression in a nice story arc within its book. Whereas I will say the second one definitely has more problems when it comes to the understanding part of particularly one storyline, and then the third one has a little bit more of structural issues from time to time. So, but I will definitely say that I enjoyed the entire series, and that the entire series is most likely now one of my favorite series that I've read so far in the fantasy genre. So that is it for my January wrap-up. That's everything that I read in January. This is the number of books that I've left on my TBR at the end of January. I went into January with 23 books, but I actually have no idea anymore where I landed off at the end of January. But yeah, my editing self will have figured that out at this point in time. But so yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. See you guys for the next one. I will hopefully this weekend be filming my February wrap-up, and then in about a month's time, that means that I'll be up to date with all of these wrap-ups in terms of their publication dates up on my channel. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that. Bye!